For generations, families of Germanic origin took root in lands that were very far from Berlin. They had arrived centuries before, summoned by kings who sought to populate empty regions, and in time they built villages, erected mills, cultivated vineyards, and founded communities where their language, faith and customs were their own. They were not invaders or adventurers, but artisans, farmers, shepherds and teachers who saw those lands as their only home. No one disputed their presence until the map of Europe transformed. The new borders, the new ideologies, and the new hatred turned their origin into a sin. They were marginalized, expelled, dispossessed without trial, and finally persecuted with a violence that erased their names from entire towns. Their history no longer mattered, only their blood. But if they were never enemies, nor invaders, nor soldiers, why was such a brutal punishment unleashed upon them when the war ended? For centuries, millions of Germans lived outside the borders of the Reich. They were in East Prussia, in Silesia, in the Danzig corridor, in Bohemia, in Moravia, in the Banat, in Transylvania, in the Bachka, in Galicia, in the Baltic, in Russia, in Romania, in Czechoslovakia, and in Yugoslavia. They were not improvised colonists or recent occupiers. In many cases, they had been there for more than 7 centuries. They were peasants, artisans, bakers, musicians, printers, religious figures, jurists, builders and merchants. They were the so-called Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans who did not have a German passport, but did have Germanic language, culture, religion and ways of life that had accompanied them since their ancestors had been invited by kings, emperors or popes to populate those depopulated or crisis-ridden regions. They were a scattered minority, integrated in many cases, but always perceived as foreign, especially when nationalisms began to govern Europe and draw borders where coexistence had previously existed. The vast majority of them settled between the 12th and 14th centuries, when Polish, Hungarian and Bohemian kings called upon them to revitalize their lands. They founded villages and cities, introduced Germanic law, and developed trade networks that linked the peoples of the East with the heart of the continent. They were on the banks of the Vistula, the Dniester, the Danube and the Elbe. In many regions, they were the majority, in others a strong minority, and almost always contributed with skilled labor, community organization, technical education, and religious participation. They created schools, monasteries, printing presses, choirs, industries, vineyards, mills, and neighborhoods. They were well received for entire generations until the 20th century arrived, and what was once diversity came to be seen as a threat. With the collapse of empires after the First World War, everything changed. Borders were redrawn. Nationalism became dogma. Millions of Germans remained outside the new Reich and became overnight foreigners within their own homes. What was once part of Europe's multi-ethnic mosaic became an uncomfortable presence. The victorious powers, gathered in Paris, divided the territories according to strategic interests and not according to ethnic realities. The Treaty of Versailles directly affected the Germans of the East. The Danzig corridor was given to Poland. Silesia was fragmented, East Prussia was isolated from the rest of Germany, and millions of Volksdeutsche came under the jurisdiction of new or reconfigured states. Austria, reduced to a small Alpine state, lost all its imperial projection. Czechoslovakia inherited regions populated by more than 3 million Germans, especially in the Sudetenland and Bohemia. In Romania, the Germans of Transylvania and the Banat were subjected to authorities who perceived them as remnants of the past. Yugoslavia absorbed the Danube Swabians, who had populated the region since the 18th century. In Poland, Germans became the target of a policy that sought the complete Polonization of its provinces. Although minority treaties were signed on paper and equality before the law was guaranteed, in practice this was never fulfilled. Germans in these regions were stripped of their properties under agrarian reform laws, displaced from their public jobs, excluded from political life, singled out for their language and religion, and marginalized in censuses. German schools were closed, publications were prohibited, policies of forced assimilation were encouraged, and mistrust was instilled in every corner. In many cases, these were peasants who could barely read, completely detached from politics, but who began to be seen as agents of the enemy. The nascent states feared that their loyalty was on the wrong side, and so everyone was treated equally, as suspects. The situation was especially difficult in Poland and Czechoslovakia. In Poland, hundreds of thousands of German peasants were forced to abandon their lands under economic or legal pressure. Authorities used agrarian reforms to expropriate properties and hand those lands over to Poles, arguing that they were Prussian inheritances or enemy colonies. In schools, German children were punished for speaking their language, and German names were forcibly Polonized. In Czechoslovakia, the Prague government promoted the Czech colonization of German-speaking areas, installing Czech officials in completely German regions and applying linguistic and educational policies that progressively reduced the Germanic cultural presence. All of this generated a growing sense of injustice, prolonged humiliation, and isolation within their own villages. Cultural and community associations were formed that sought to preserve their identity, but they were increasingly monitored and repressed by local authorities. As Czech, Slovak, Hungarian, Romanian, and Polish nationalism hardened, the German presence began to be perceived as a foreign body that had to disappear, or at least dilute itself. At the same time, from the other side, in Germany and Austria, nationalist parties began to use the situation of the Volksdeutsche as a political argument. The narrative of reunion and the protection of Eastern Germans gained strength, and although many of these groups had never asked for the Reich's intervention, they ended up becoming an excuse for expansion. Propaganda presented them as martyrs, as victims of a hostile world that only Berlin could defend. Some minority leaders began to cooperate with this idea, especially in the Sudetenland, where unemployment was high and frustration very deep. But the majority remained trapped between two fires. On one side, the hostility of the states in which they lived. On the other, the pressure from a German regime that wanted them as a tool. The 1930s intensified the problem. Authoritarian regimes in Eastern Europe increased restrictions. The governments of Poland and Czechoslovakia feared a fifth column and acted harshly. German minorities were placed under constant surveillance, and all cultural, religious, or community activity began to be seen as a threat. In many places, Lutheran priests were expelled or forced to preach in the official language, German cemeteries were vandalized, and libraries were closed. The daily lives of these people, who only wanted to work and survive, became an exercise in passive resistance. Resentment accumulated in silence. The idea that they were being punished for a war they had not caused, and for a policy they had not asked for, settled in as a dull pain. Daily contempt, mockery, symbolic violence, and the indifference of the authorities created a breeding ground that did not need much to explode. And when the annexation of the Sudetenland occurred in 1938 and the invasion of Poland in 1939, everything changed again. The war altered everything, but the hatred had already been sown long before. When the conflict broke out, the Volksdeutsche were trapped between two worlds. Many were used by the Nazi regime to justify interventions, others were forced to enlist in the Waffen-SS, and others were simply left to their fate. Reprisals began even before the war ended. In some villages, Germans were lynched by mobs, expelled without explanation, marked as enemies. And when 1945 arrived, the hatred accumulated for decades erupted with all its fury. That hatred did not come from nowhere. It had been slowly cooked, with policies of exclusion, with hate speech, with fear and nationalism. It was not just a reaction to Nazism. It was older. The resentment for centuries of Germanic presence, for the economy they had dominated in certain regions, for the distinct culture, for the language, for the religion, for everything that reminded them of the imperial past, was what fueled the idea that Germans had to pay, whoever they were. The punishment was ready long before the first Soviet rifle was fired. In the minds of many, deserved punishment needed no distinctions. It did not matter if it was a woman, child, elderly person, or farmer. It was enough to be German to become guilty. And that logic would be what marked the following years, when there was nothing left to destroy and only people remained. People born in East Prussia or the Carpathians, who had never set foot in Berlin or participated in any war. People who would now be torn from their homes, their lands, their graves, their memories. All that would come later. But it began here, with contempt, with daily humiliation, with the idea that the other had to be erased, that revenge had to be taken not on a regime but on a people. In the autumn of 1944, when the Red Army crossed Germany's eastern border for the first time, a chapter of horror began that few had imagined possible. Soviet propaganda had prepared its troops with a clear message: merciless revenge. In posters, in harangues, in newspapers, slogans were repeated that called for punishing Germans without distinction. The soldiers marched with the certainty that every German woman was spoils, every house a trophy, every child a reminder of the war they had suffered. In that climate of hatred, violence knew no bounds. The first blow fell on East Prussia. There was Nemmersdorf, a quiet agricultural village of no military importance, where the majority were women, children, and elderly people. On the 21st of October, 1944, Soviet troops entered the village. What the Germans found when they recaptured the place days later became a symbol of what was to come. Bodies of naked women hung from barn doors, elderly people lay in the streets with signs of point-blank execution, children appeared crushed against walls, and houses were looted. There were testimonies describing how entire groups of villagers had been lined up and shot without explanation. The impact of what happened in Nemmersdorf was so great that it was even used in war newsreels, but beyond propaganda, the facts were documented by neutral witnesses, such as foreign liaison officers who confirmed the magnitude of the slaughter. The pattern was repeated in other localities in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia. With each advance, the civilian population became a deliberate target. Elderly women, young girls, none were safe. There were accounts of women who, after being attacked by several soldiers, were killed with coup de grace shots or left agonizing on the roads. In many villages, the scene was repeated with brutal precision. First, the looting of houses and stables, then the rapes, then the murders, and finally the burning of homes to erase all traces. The arrival of winter further aggravated the drama. Caravans of civilians began to flee westward, but they did so under impossible conditions. Wooden carts pulled by horses, mothers carrying their children in their arms, elderly people leaning on walking sticks, families advancing along snow-covered paths while listening to the roar of cannons behind them. Many of these columns were attacked from the air by Soviet planes, which machine-gunned the refugees indiscriminately. Those who fell on the road were abandoned. There was no time to stop nor strength to drag frozen bodies. The testimonies collected later by Desires show the extent to which terror seized the population. A woman recounted how, in her village, Soviet soldiers entered, firing at everything that moved. Her father was executed in front of the house door, her mother beaten unconscious, and she, barely 16 years old, raped by 4 men consecutively. When she regained consciousness, she found her mother dead and her little brother hanging from a beam. It was not an isolated case. There were hundreds, thousands, every village with similar stories repeated with a mechanical cruelty. The chaos was absolute. There were no German authorities to protect civilians. Wehrmacht soldiers were in retreat or dispersed. The few who remained were quickly overwhelmed. The villages were left without defenders, and the population, unarmed and terrorized, could do nothing. They sought refuge in churches, in basements, in stables, but the violence reached them nonetheless. The Soviets dragged people to the squares, forced them to hand over the little they had, and then subjected them to collective abuses. The terror was not accidental. It was part of a climate fostered by orders and slogans that repeated the need to settle scores. On the roads, refugee convoys offered a desperate image. Children crying from hunger, pregnant women giving birth in the snow, corpses abandoned on the sides of the road. Horses died of exhaustion and carts were left behind, forcing families to walk barefoot in sub-zero temperatures. The Soviet army, instead of protecting civilians, harassed them. Many refugees were forced to stop and hand over their belongings: watches, rings, coats, boots. Anyone who resisted was shot on the spot. Testimonies speak of bodies piled in ditches, of dead children in their mothers' arms, of entire families disappeared without a trace. Elders of 80 years were beaten to death, nuns raped in convents, priests executed in churches. In some cases, victims were tortured with a cruelty that seemed to seek a spectacle of humiliation. Women were forced to undress in public squares and raped in groups while their children were forced to watch. Afterwards, they were shot, and their bodies left lying in front of the terrified children. The winter of 1945 turned the flight into an even greater ordeal. Snow covered everything, and the cold killed those who did not have adequate clothing. Many babies died of hypothermia in their mothers' arms, and the mothers, too weak to keep walking, collapsed on the roads. Those who survived remembered for decades the sound of groans, the frozen bodies in positions of pain, the bloodstains in the snow. Hunger also struck mercilessly. Entire families ate tree bark or roots to resist one more day. Desperation led to scenes that seemed taken from another era, with mothers offering their daughters to soldiers in exchange for a piece of bread. The archives of the United States Army captured images and testimonies confirming this tragedy. Films of the era showed endless caravans of refugees advancing along icy roads, Soviet guards watching over German prisoners with hateful gazes, entire villages reduced to ashes. Military documents collected reports of mass rapes and summary executions. Even neutral observers, such as members of the Red Cross, reported scenes of horror. Although many times their reports were archived without echo for fear of political tensions, the feeling of abandonment was total. German civilians knew there was no possible salvation. If they fled, snow, hunger, or bullets reached them. If they stayed, Soviet soldiers arrived with their burden of revenge. There was no refuge, no authority to turn to, no protection. The German state was collapsing, and the civilian population paid the price. Villages became scenes of horror, fields improvised cemeteries, roads routes of suffering. Every testimony collected speaks of the same feeling, the certainty that there was no escape. The terror had a symbolic objective in addition to a physical one. It was the complete inversion of the power hierarchy. The people who had invaded Russia in 1941 were now subjected to collective punishment. Public humiliation, the destruction of homes were a form of message. This happens to Germans, to all, without exception. It did not matter if they were peasants who had never left their village, if they were elderly women or children of 5 years old. German identity was enough to justify any abuse. The harshness of winter, hunger, indiscriminate violence and abandonment created an atmosphere that survived in collective memory for generations. What began in Nemmersdorf was not an isolated case, but the prelude to what thousands of villages would experience between 1944 and 1945. It was hell at home. The war was no longer on distant fronts nor in battles between soldiers. It was in kitchens, in stables, in churches. And that hell had a unique face, that of the invader who arrived with the order to destroy everything that bore a German name. In the midst of that darkness, the testimonies coincide on the same sensation: absolute fear. It was not a fleeting or localized fear. It was a permanent terror, the conviction that death could arrive at any moment, in any form, with no possibility of resistance. That fear, accompanied by hunger, cold, and violence, became the daily atmosphere for millions of East Germans in the last months of the war. And from that fear would emerge the next stage: mass expulsions and deportations, which would transform what was already hell into an even greater disaster. In 1945, when the war was about to conclude in Europe, the Allied leaders began to discuss not only the military defeat of the Third Reich, but also the future of millions of people living in territories where borders would change forever. At the conferences in Yalta first and Potsdam afterwards, there was open talk of the transfer of German populations who had resided for centuries in regions such as East Prussia, Silesia, Sudetenland, Hungary, Romania, or Yugoslavia. The idea was presented with diplomatic, almost aseptic language, under the concept that these expulsions would be carried out in an orderly and humane manner. However, what was experienced on the ground was quite the opposite: a gigantic operation of ethnic cleansing that resulted in millions of people becoming refugees, and an uncountable number of deaths in the process. The contrast between what was agreed upon in the offices and the brutal reality of the expulsions was immediate. In theory, it was a measure intended to avoid future nationalist tensions, separating populations to create ethnically homogeneous states. In practice, it meant forced marches of women, children, and the elderly, transit camps in subhuman conditions, deportations on cattle trains, summary executions, and a climate of total impunity in which local militias, often with the complicity of the authorities, unleashed their hatred against German minorities. In Czechoslovakia, where resentment against the Sudets was particularly strong, the expulsions began immediately. Thousands of families were forced to abandon their homes with only a few hours' notice. They were ordered to carry a small amount of luggage, leaving behind homes, farms, shops, and belongings accumulated for generations. Under the surveillance of soldiers and armed militias, they were gathered in squares and then led on foot to the so-called transfer camps. There, they were registered, stripped of the little they still retained, and held for days or weeks in conditions of extreme overcrowding, awaiting embarkation on trains that would take them to Germany. The trains were freight wagons, designed for animals or goods, without seats or heating, without sufficient water or food. They were filled with up to 80 or 100 people per wagon, locked with padlocks, and the journey could last several days. During the journey, many died of hunger, thirst, cold, or diseases. The bodies were thrown off at stops, often without any ceremony, while the survivors continued their journey in silence. Subsequent reports show that thousands perished in these convoys, which multiplied during 1945 and 1946, transporting millions towards an uncertain destination. Poland, which had received large territories from the German East, was another central scenario for the expulsions. There, local authorities organized massive marches in which entire villages were forced to walk towards the border under the surveillance of armed soldiers. The columns stretched for kilometers, and those who lagged behind, whether due to weakness or illness, were executed on the spot. Abandoned bodies remained on the roads, and survivors advanced with the certainty that they could be next. Many testimonies collected afterwards described the desperation of mothers trying to keep their children alive amidst the cold and lack of food, resorting to begging for a little water or sharing crumbs of stale bread. In Hungary and Romania, the situation was no different. There, where German communities had lived for centuries, hostility erupted with force. Properties were confiscated, families evicted and sent to transit camps. In some cases, the expulsions were carried out in coordination with Soviet troops, who did not hesitate to recruit men for forced labor in mines or factories in the Soviet Union. Many of those deported never returned. In Yugoslavia, partisan militias undertook a particularly bloody repression. The Germans of Banat were persecuted, their goods confiscated, and thousands were murdered in collective executions. Those who survived were interned in camps where hunger, diseases, and ill treatment caused havoc. The so-called transfer camps became centers of suffering. They were set up in old factories, stables, barracks, or simple open-air enclosures. Overcrowding was extreme, food scarce, and hygiene non-existent. Epidemics spread rapidly, and those who fell ill rarely received medical attention. Women were vulnerable to abuse by guards and militiamen, while men were beaten or executed under arbitrary accusations of collaboration with Nazism. Later testimonies describe scenes of mothers watching their children die from diarrhea or fevers without being able to do anything, of families separated by force, of systematic looting that left people with only the clothes on their backs. Brutality was not limited to deprivation. There were summary executions in entire villages as collective reprisals. In Czechoslovakia, episodes were documented where Germans were gathered in barns and shot, or thrown into mass graves dug beforehand. In Poland, many prisoners were forced to dig trenches that later became their own graves. Impunity was total. Local militias acted with the tacit backing of authorities who saw these actions as part of a historical reckoning. Survivors' testimonies recount the experience of walking kilometers under custody, hungry and thirsty, not knowing if they would reach their destination alive. Some relate how guards shot those who tried to collect a little water from streams, or how they forced them to march barefoot in the snow. Fear was permanent. Each day could end in execution or in the definitive separation of the family. Personal belongings were plundered again and again, until the only thing left was the clothes they wore. Documents from the time, including Red Cross reports and records from military authorities, show that the number of deaths during the expulsions was immense. Although the exact figures vary, there is talk of hundreds of thousands who did not survive the transfers, marches, and camps. To these are added millions who lost their homes, properties, and communities forever. What had officially been described as a controlled transfer became a human catastrophe of colossal dimensions. In Czechoslovakia, in particular, the figures are staggering. Nearly 3 million Germans from the Sudets were expelled in a few months. In Poland, millions more were displaced from Silesia, Pomerania, and East Prussia. In Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia, although on a smaller scale, German communities were also practically eliminated. The magnitude of the process was unprecedented in modern European history. It was the largest forced displacement up to that moment. The discourse of orderly and humane remained a cruel irony in the face of what truly happened. For those who experienced it, there was no order or humanity, only hunger, cold, fear, and death. The images of endless columns of displaced persons, of bodies abandoned in ditches, were etched forever in the memory of those who survived. Every testimony collected by Desaius confirms that reality. What was presented as a political measure ended up being an act of ethnic cleansing executed with ruthless violence. When trains, marches, and endless human columns finally crossed into what remained of Germany, what the expellees expected was not refuge or relief, but another form of suffering. The country was in ruins, cities reduced to rubble by bombings, millions of people were already struggling to survive, and there was not enough space, food, or shelter to receive those who arrived exhausted after weeks of hunger, cold, and violence. For those who had endured the expulsion, that destination did not mean the end of punishment, but the beginning of a life marked by misery, marginalization, and oblivion. In West Germany, and also in East Germany, the arrival of millions of refugees posed an unprecedented challenge. They were peasants, artisans, merchants, entire families who had been stripped of everything and who suddenly appeared in destroyed villages or cities, asking for help in a country that could barely sustain its own inhabitants. In many cases, there were no houses, only ruins, and the newcomers had to settle in semi-ruined basements, in makeshift barracks or in stables. Often several families were forced to share a single room, sleeping on the floor, taking turns to use one bed, cooking on stoves made with bricks and scrap metal. Hunger was another constant. Supply systems had collapsed, rationing affected the entire population, and the expellees arrived without reserves, without land to cultivate, and without local contacts to help them. They depended entirely on ration cards, which were often delivered late or in smaller quantities than to others. It was not uncommon for them to spend entire days with barely a crust of stale bread or watery soup. Children suffered chronic malnutrition, and diseases spread rapidly in those conditions. The rejection of the local population aggravated the situation. For many Germans who had endured years of bombings, hunger, and losses, the newcomers were intruders who came to dispute the little that remained. They were contemptuously called those from outside or those from the east, and were often treated as second-class citizens, suspicious strangers in their own country. There were villages where expellees were forbidden to use community wells, markets, or schools, and there were not a few cases in which they were blamed for recent misfortunes, as if they were carriers of defeat or uncomfortable reminders of the immediate past. In the Eastern Zone, under Soviet control, the situation was no better. There, expellees were also housed in precarious conditions, and many were forced to work on collective farms or in the reconstruction of destroyed factories. They had no choice, accept hard, poorly paid jobs or simply starve. Misery was shared by the entire population, but the expellees started from an even more disadvantageous position because they had no family networks, no property, and no recognized rights. They were a displaced mass, stripped of identity, viewed with suspicion. Over time, authorities tried to organize the distribution of the millions of people, sending them to agricultural regions that needed labor or to industrial areas under reconstruction. However, this did not solve the problem of rejection. In schools, expellee children were ridiculed for their accent or their ragged clothes, and many dropped out of school prematurely. Adults, even if they were qualified teachers, merchants, or artisans, rarely could practice their professions and were relegated to heavy manual labor. Integration was slow, full of obstacles, and marked by a stigma difficult to erase. The silence imposed by the Allied powers aggravated this isolation. What happened to the expelled Germans was not mentioned in the media, nor in official reports, nor in public speeches. It was an uncomfortable topic, because the dominant narrative was that of punishment for Nazism and the reconstruction of Europe on new foundations. Recognizing the suffering of millions of Germans did not fit into that vision, and for decades, the experience of the expellees was deliberately ignored. Testimonies were relegated to family memory, told in low voices within homes, passed from parents to children, but never publicly acknowledged. In West Germany, where the new state was consolidated with the support of the United States and its allies, silence was also a policy of stability. The government needed to integrate into the West, advance economic reconstruction, and leave the war behind. Speaking too much about the fate of the refugees from the East could generate tensions with neighboring countries, now strategic allies. Therefore, although there were expellee organizations that tried to make their situation visible, they were given little space in national politics. In the 50s and 60s, while the economic miracle transformed Germany, millions of expellees continued to live in poverty or in refugee camps that remained active for much longer than official memory wanted to remember. In East Germany, the issue was erased even more harshly. The communist regime presented the expulsion as an act of historical justice and as a necessary step for peace with Poland and Czechoslovakia. Expellees were forced to be silent, not to mention their origins, to even renounce their cultural identity. Speaking of losses, sufferings, or injustices was seen as a betrayal of socialism. Silence became the norm, and generations grew up with the order to forget what had happened. The psychological consequences were profound. Millions of people were marked by a collective trauma that rarely found space for expression. The feeling of having been victims, but at the same time forced to be silent, created a sense of displacement that persisted for decades. Many families never spoke again of their place of origin, keeping maps and photos in hidden boxes, as if they were evidence of a life that officially did not exist. The children and grandchildren of these expellees grew up without knowing the complete story, but feeling the weight of a past that was intuitively painful and rarely spoken aloud. Marginalization was also expressed in legal and material terms. For years, expellees received no real compensation for lost properties. Their homes, lands, and businesses remained in the hands of others, and claims were ignored or dismissed as politically inconvenient. In West Germany, some aid arrived slowly, but it never amounted to what was lost. In the East, claims were simply impossible. Thus, poverty and exclusion were perpetuated in many families for generations. And yet, despite everything, integration advanced, albeit unevenly. Over time, the children of the expellees grew up, studied, worked, and little by little blended into the life of the country. Many married locals, and differences gradually blurred. The prosperity of West Germany in the 60s and 70s alleviated material misery, although it did not erase the memory of the initial rejection. In the East, assimilation was more forced, but also inevitable. The result was that the German communities of the East disappeared as such, absorbed into the life of a divided and then reunified Germany, where their stories were reduced to footnotes. The epilogue of this tragedy is that even today, many descendants of those expellees are still not fully recognized as victims. The memory of their sufferings does not occupy a central place in the European narrative on the post-war period, overshadowed by other accounts relegated to the background. Their testimonies are collected in associations, in specialized publications, in limited commemorative acts, but they have not received the attention they deserve. The collective trauma remains, inherited from generation to generation, reminding us that millions of people were stripped of their homeland and then condemned to silence. The absence of justice is evident. Those responsible for the expulsions, for the transit camps, for the forced marches, rarely faced consequences. The states involved built their legitimacy on the outcome of these expulsions, and no international court questioned them. The expellees were trapped in a paradox. They were victims of mass crimes, but due to their nationality and the historical context of the war, they were denied for decades the right to be seen as such. That denial of memory is perhaps the cruelest way to prolong suffering. It was not enough to lose home, land, language, and community. They were also deprived of the possibility of telling their story in public and being recognized as part of the European tragedy of the 20th century. Today, when barely the last direct witnesses are alive, the task of remembering becomes even more urgent. Their voices, their stories, their documents are the only guarantee that they will not be reduced to a diffuse statistic or a footnote in history. The final call is clear. It is not about justifying or minimizing what others suffered during the war, but about recognizing that these people were also victims and that pain cannot be measured by nationality. Denying them that recognition is to repeat the injustice. The misery, rejection, silence, and dishonor that marked their lives are an inseparable part of European history, and ignoring it only perpetuates division. Remembering the expellees does not mean erasing other memories, but doing justice to those who for too long were forgotten by all.